right, now we're on the way to our next system. This is the bone and skeletal tissue, which is going to contribute to the skeletal system, right? So we know we have skeletal muscle, which moves this skeletal system, but we're focusing on the actual bone part of it at this point. So we have it separated into two different chapters. We're starting out with talking about the system overall. Then we're going to be talking about the tissue and the cells that make it up. So, again, part of our gradually increasing physiology, etc. Again, a lot of anatomy here. We're talking about different cell types. We're talking about different bones, different bony markings you're going to be learning in lab. And only a little bit of physiology in terms of how bones grow and how bones develop, etc. Okay, so initially during development, for the most part, our bones, all 206 of them, maybe more if you are so lucky, we'll talk about that later, start out as a cartilage model like you see here with the x-ray on the right. Cartilage is our precursor to the bone itself. Now when we look at the distribution of this bony tissue, we can see that it's forming this endoskeleton. There are certain organisms that have exoskeletons, like crustaceans and things like that, but we have an endoskeleton. So it still forms the framework of our body, and it helps to protect and encase our different organs, but it also allows us to move because, like we said, the muscles are going to be attached to it. So remember when we were talking about different tissue types, to be sure, we're going to have our bone tissue in here, but we're going to find a lot of other tissue types in there too. Different types of connective tissues, hyaline cartilage and elastic cartilage, and even fibrocartilage. But we're also going to see that each and every bone of the system is an organ. And so it's going to be mostly bone tissue, but we're going to find other tissues in there as well. Now when we talk about the development of the bone, we say that most of it starts as cartilage, but how does the cartilage actually grow? And when we look at these two terms, we're going to see them both in the growth of cartilage as well as the growth of bone. So we have what's called appositional growth, and that is where we actually have cartilage forming cells, right? The chondroblasts that are actively secreting our cartilaginous matrix. And then we have interstitial growth, which are the mature cells, the chondrocytes. Remember, we're talking about the mature cells, where they are just sitting in their apartments, sitting in their lacunae, and they're helping to maintain the cartilaginous tissue from within instead. Okay. So, let's start out then with what's the function of these bones, these organs that contribute to this organ system. 7 important functions of bones. We've got support, like we said. We've got protection. We've got movement. And then we have mineral and growth factor storage. So everybody knows that, we got to have calcium for the bones. We talked about vitamin D coming from the skin in the last chapter, helping us to absorb calcium in the intestine to put it into the bones. One of the interesting things to think about is a lot of people look at bones and are thinking, oh, they're just these little sticks that are inside of me. But like we said, each bone is an organ made up of different tissues, made up of living cells. And we'll talk about those cells as well. But the bones as well are very dynamic organs where they're constantly being remodeled. In a way, they are kind of like your refrigerator or your pantry where you stock up on substances, you put them in there, not for storage for forever, but until you need it, and then you take it from there. It's this constant dynamic of storing and then taking from storage happening all the time in these bones. All right, other functions of bones that maybe you weren't aware of. Blood cell formation. So hematopoiesis that we'll talk about in the cardiovascular system, most all of the different cells, blood cells that we have in the body, red blood cells, white blood cells, and even platelets come from the bones. Additionally, they do fat storage. So fat, like we talked about as a tissue, is there for protection, etc. But in terms of an energy source, right? When you take in too much energy, we have to be able to store it somewhere, subcutaneous fat, but also fat is contained within spaces within the bones. And then lastly, hormone production. There's a hormone that's called osteocalcin that helps to actually regulate energy and metabolism in the body. It takes energy to build bones. This process, like we said, is happening all the time. So it's not too surprising maybe that it's going to be linked to overall growth in the body and energy levels. Okay, so those are functions for our bones and for our skeletal system. So now let's get to the classification of bones. We said that there are 206 bones in the average body. Could be more if you actually have extra bones, typically in the skull, but you won't know that until after you're dead and we can look at your skull. But of the bones that you have, they're divided into two different regions based on their location. Let's take a look at that figure again. You can see here we've got bones that are part of the axial skeleton, right along the main axis of the body, that are shown in kind of that orange color. So the skull, the vertebral column, the sacrum, as well as the coccyx, and then the ribs and the sternum. All of those bones that are within the main axis of the body. The bones of the appendages are part of the appendicular skeleton instead. All right, so we see our organization as well. And now we need to classify the bones. So when we looked at that diagram, we can see that the bones, even though we typically think of a bone as being this elongated structure with two big ends, maybe like the femur or something like that, right? You have a generic bone shape like we see there, right? But there's lots of different other bone shapes that we see too that don't fit the mold of what we would call a long bone. So while many of them are long bones, like we talk about those in the limbs, there are other types of bones as well. So each and every bone that you learn, you need to be able to classify it in these four categories. Is it a long bone? Even the bones of the phalanges count as long bones. Much like the simple columnar cells of epithelium are taller than they are wide, if you have a bone that has those dimensions as well, even as small as it is, can still count as a long bone. So we have long bones. There's also short bones. Short bones are a little bit more cube shaped, so they're about as high as they are wide. And then we also have flat bones like the calvarium here, as well as the scapula and the sternum. The ribs are interesting if you look closely at them, they tend to be flattened. So they kind of count as flat bones even though they do seem long. So some of these, they kind of straddle the line between the different classifications. Even the scapulae, when you look at them, they have parts of them that are very irregularly shaped that stick off at different angles, but for the most part they are kind of a flattish bone. So they fall there, as opposed to our last category, which are the irregular bones, like the vertebrae and the hip bones. So we can see examples of long bones and irregular bones and short bones like those of the wrist, those of the ankle, and then our flat bones. Alright, so now let's look at bone structure. Like we said, an individual bone counts as an organ. It's mostly going to be connective tissue in the form of our osseous. Remember, this is our hardened connective tissue. But you're also going to have nervous tissue, right? If you break a bone and it hurts, it's not just a dead stick in there. Cartilage, like we said, on the ends of bones often. Different types of fibrous connective tissue. There may be muscle cells associated with it as well, and definitely epithelial cells that are kind of lining the blood vessels that keep it alive. So when we look at the bones, we can definitely look at them on a macroscopic level, or the gross structure of them, and that's often what we're doing. We're going to also take a look at them on the microscopic level, because on the microscopic level, that's where we can start to see the cells, the living units of these tissues and organs. And then there's also the chemical level, what makes them up, etc. All right. Other things that we see about bone in terms of gross anatomy, not disgusting, but macroscopic anatomy, is we have two different types of bony tissue. We have what's called compact bone and spongy bone. And when we were learning the different types of tissue before, and we were looking at bone tissue and it looked like kind of these columns or cut off trees where you can see the rings like we were talking about with the osteocytes in there, that was an example of compact bone. And we said it's a bit like if you have an M&M and it has a hard candy shell on the outside, that's kind of like the compact bone. So it's towards the outside, it's very, very strong. And then on the inside, we tend to have spongy bone. Now, it's not spongy as in it's flexible and squishy, but the fact that it has cavities to it instead. It's still very strong, but it has these cavities that allow things to be stored inside. So, for instance, like red bone marrow or yellow bone marrow. Now, we said that most bones, when we think of a bone, a generic bone, we're thinking of a long bone. And we'll look at a long bone in terms of a part of a bone, parts of a bone. But before that, we'll look at some of the tour of these other types of bones, like short, irregular, and flat bones. So what we find is that we actually have, again, our compact bone towards the outside, like an M&M, and then our spongy bone, which is sometimes called diplo, on the inside. And so it's kind of sandwiched a little bit like an Oreo cookie again. So when we look at it, it looks kind of like this. So this is some of the bones of the cranium that we see out here. So we see compact bone along the outside here, and then our spongy bone within. So you can see these trabeculae, these kind of web-like structures throughout, and then spaces within. So most of our other types of bones have this type of structure to them. It's just layers, compact bone on the outside, and then our spongy bone on the inside. That also occurs in our typical long bone, but when we have these long bones, we actually have different parts of them, the ends, the middle, and layers, and things like that. So let's take a look at a figure of our typical long bone. It looks like this. Now this is the humerus, right? This is our funny bone, get it? So what we find is that if we're using the humerus as a typical type of long bone, what we're going to see is we've got two ends to it that are kind of expansive. These are called the epiphyses, right? Epiphyses have E, just like ends do. So the ends are called epiphyses. Remember distal, proximal. So this is further out on the limb, out here. And this is then closer on the limb, back here. So it's a proximal and distal epiphyses. The diaphysis is basically the shaft. We also find that we have compact bone towards the outside, and then we do have spongy bone towards the inside in those epiphyses. In the very center of the bone, we have what's called a medullary cavity. So while this may have some kind of spongy bone along the edge of it, it's an open cavity, and you will see one of these in lab. And the open cavity that's in here is actually where we store some of that yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is back. In the spongy bone that we see out here, that's where we actually have red marrow, which is where the blood cells are produced. A couple other things that we'll see here. We have membranes associated with the bone. On the outside, we have a periosteum wrapping all the way around, and lining the inside, like lining the medullary cavity, we have an endosteum. So if we zoom up on that, it tends to look like this. So again, we're going to find our periosteum towards the outside. Now, if you're on the very end of a bone, where a bone is going to be articulating with another bone, you may also have articular cartilage out there. But we have periosteum out here, just in between, like in this area. Then here's some of our compact bone, right? The candy shell, if you will. And then we have a little bit of that spongy bone, and if it's the epiphyses, it may go all the way through. Otherwise, you're going to have your medullary cavity in here, where you're going to have that yellow bone marrow. Now, notice that we have blood vessels going throughout. If we have cells all distributed throughout here, those cells are living and they need nutrients and oxygen. They got to get rid of waste products, etc. So the bone tissue is highly vascularized, which is one of the reasons that it actually heals pretty well. All right, so like we said, there are membranes associated with bones. One towards the outside is called the periosteum, one on the inside that's called the endosteum, right? Osteo, you'll see that all the time as a suffix. That means bone. So perio, around, basically, endo, inside. So the periosteum that we see towards the outside, there's a fibrous layer to it, and there's an osteogenic layer, which is where a lot of our bone-producing cells are going to be just underneath. And actually it has the passageways and holes for some of our blood vessels to be able to sneak through it. The periosteum on the outside of a bone also can be continuous with some of our other connective tissues of tendons and ligaments. So tendons, remember, tendons and ligaments are made up of what connective tissue type? A lot of fibers, all parallel arrangement. Dense, regular connective tissue. So both tendons and ligaments have to be strong. They're made up of dense, regular connective tissue. Ligaments hold bone to bone. tendons hold muscle to bone. But in both cases, they kind of feed right into that periosteum and connect with it. Now, endosteum, like we said, is lining the inner medullary cavity. It covers the trabeculae of the spongy bone as well, and it as well lines some of the canals where we see blood vessels going through that compact bone. So we can see it here is the periosteum on the outside. You see these little Sharpies fibers. These are like little tacks holding it on. And then endosteum is going to be lining the inside instead. Okay, other things that we find out about the gross anatomy of bone tissue. We said that in that spongy bone is where we find the hematopoietic tissue, right? The red bone marrow. Now the red bone marrow where we produce blood cells, it can certainly be in the ends or the epiphyses of bones, like in the humerus and the femur and stuff like that. But interestingly enough, most of the red bone marrow that we have actually come from some of our flat bones. And some of the irregular bones. So for instance, like the sternum and even some of the ribs and places like that are some of the major areas where red blood cells are produced. The hip bones have a big cavity within them where we have a lot of spongy bone too. And so that's where in adults at least, a lot of the red blood cells and different blood cell types will come from. That's why if you're going to do a marrow donation, if you ever hear about that, if you do a marrow donation, they take a large needle and they'll insert it into the hip and extract some of the marrow out of that. Yellow marrow, like we said, is basically energy storage, but the interesting thing about it is yellow marrow, under certain circumstances, can be converted into red marrow. Basically, the red marrow can displace the yellow marrow if we need some more, like if you're anemic. All right, one of the other things that we see at the gross anatomy of a bone is that they always have all these different bumps and holes and dips to them. And so these are called bony markings, and these are going to be very critical for us as we go through the lab and we learn the different parts of a bone, because these are the places where blood vessels go through or nerves go through or our muscles are going to attach, things like that. So there's three major types of bony markings. Those things that stick out, so these are projections, and they oftentimes give a place for a ligament to attach, or if you have a muscle and a tendon's coming down, if you have something sticking out, it can hold on to that. We also have depressions, right? They can be very steep depressions like a bowl, or very shallow depressions, but oftentimes a muscle will lay in that particular area, or maybe a passageway for a nerve or a tendon to cut through or something like that. And then we have openings, actual holes, and this is where a blood vessel is actually going to go through the bone, or a nerve is going to go through the bone instead. So table 6.1 does a good job of showing you a lot of the specific names of these different types of markings. So you can see that there are specific names. So when we look at projections, lots of different types of projections. Tuberosities tend to be kind of rounded projections. Crests tend to be as like a wave crest along the edge, etc. If you look at, there's also tubercles that stick out, condyles and epicondyles that are raised areas. There's also spines, like on the scapula. There's going to be the spine of the scapula that you can actually feel along here. So it's kind of a sharper projection, etc. And then you'll see process as well. Process is kind of generic, just kind of sticks off of a bone. So lots of different examples of these different things sticking off of bones that we'll be learning later on. Still more projections. Sometimes you'll see head, like we said, condyle, etc. Depressions and openings. So foramen is going to be one that you see very regularly. So that's a hole that's going through. Sinuses are going to be a hole that is totally enclosed, like in the frontal bone here, right? So if you get sinus pain, that's because you're getting pain associated with that space that's in there. A fossa, like Mufasa, no. So a fossa is kind of a shallow depression instead of an actual hole. So you'll need to kind of learn those terms that we see in the table. Just like we said, it's going to be critical, just like learning a language, to know these particular terms, because you're going to see them again and again and again as we're applying them to particular bones as you're learning the bones of the body. Okay, so right now what we've done is we've done an introduction to the skeletal system in terms of what does it do, etc. Some broad scale organization, axial skeleton, appendicular skeleton. We talked about different ways that you can classify the bones according to their cell shape, or sorry, the bone shape and things like that. We talked about different types of bone tissue, compact bone and spongy bone, and then we started looking at the gross anatomy of the bone, talking about the parts of the bone, the ends of a long bone, the shaft of the long bone, the different layers and connective tissues, and now specific bony markings as well. From here, we're going to go from macroscopic, gross anatomy, to microscopic and work our way down inside and look at those different types of cells.